Buonasera a tutti, sono molto contento che partano questi seminari della Società Italiana degli Economisti, seminari online o webinar, come ormai si usa dire. L'idea che abbiamo avuto, ovviamente seguendo anche le tantissime esperienze che ci sono in giro per il mondo attualmente di seminari online a causa delle misure di lockdown che impediscono i seminari dal vivo, è quello appunto di mantenere il contatto con i soci e dare la possibilità di avviare una discussione chiaramente in questo momento fondamentalmente su tante tematiche collegate al Covid-19, che ovviamente dopo l'aspetto sanitario è oramai del tutto evidente che genererà effetti economici assolutamente non di secondo ordine, mettiamola così. Poi quanto gravi saranno si vedrà mano a mano che le cose andranno avanti. Come primo seminario siamo felicissimi di avere con noi Guido Lorenzoni, che poi Marco presenterà più in dettaglio. Io dico solo che Guido è Brin Family Professor of Economics alla Northwestern University, è editor del Journal of International Economics, ha pubblicato su temi di macroeconomia, teoria dei cicli, bolle, su tutte le più importanti riviste economiche, sui cosiddetti top 5, quindi tutti abbiamo studiato macroeconomia, le ultime cose sui suoi lavori, quindi siamo felicissimi di averlo. Presenterà questo lavoro sulle implicazioni macroeconomiche del Covid. Io a questo punto, dopo averlo ringraziato, lascio la parola a Marco per una presentazione più dettagliata del nostro relatore e per descrivere brevemente le regole del gioco di questo nuovo seminario, questa nuova modalità di fare seminari.
No, ti ringrazio, grazie molto Alberto. Sì, in realtà sulla presentazione sarò leggero, l'hai anticipata un po' tu. Io vorrei, prima di dare la parola a Guido, che ovviamente ringrazio anch'io molto, in particolare ho avuto l'occasione di conoscerlo la prima volta, insomma incontrarlo la prima volta nel 2016 ad Ancona, quando venne per una lezione della Fondazione Giorgio Foà. Ecco, lo ringrazio molto, insomma, perché l'occasione di rivederlo, rincontrarlo come seminario iniziale di questo ciclo importante di incontri è per me veramente estremamente gradita. Io prendo veramente pochi secondi per dare un po' di informazioni come dire, operative relative a come si svolgerà questo seminario e probabilmente utili anche per i prossimi seminari che faremo. Riguardo all'incontro, l'incontro è prevede 40-45 minuti di presentazioni da parte di Guido, e al termine del quale poi noi avevamo pensato di lasciare 15-20 minuti al massimo di spazio per un'interazione con i partecipanti, quindi domande o commenti che come dire, più brevi sono, non perché io voglia tagliarle prima di riceverle, però se sono brevi consentono a più partecipanti di intervenire. Ovviamente la modalità che seguiremo non sarà quella, direi, fredda, che impone ai partecipanti di darci le domande sullo spazio riservato alle Q&A, ma chiederemo ai partecipanti di iscriversi per la domanda, in modo che noi possiamo poi fare una sequenza, costruire una sequenza di candidati e a loro accendere il microfono e quindi consentire a chi vuole, ai partecipanti, di porre direttamente al relatore la domanda di interesse. Questo incontro sarà registrato e quindi da qui a qualche giorno lo troverete in forma offline, insomma, sul sito della SIE. Riguardo ai prossimi incontri segnalo, l'ha già ricordato Alberto, che la call for speakers che abbiamo fatto su questo tema è stata abbastanza apprezzata, potremmo dire. Abbiamo avuto numerose proposte di seminario, al punto che abbiamo dovuto abbandonare l'ipotesi di farne uno al mese o uno ogni 2 settimane. Siamo passati per ora a un webinar settimanale. Quindi il prossimo incontro sarà il 14 di maggio sulle catene globali del valore, poi ne avremo un altro il 21 di maggio, quindi a distanza di una settimana, sul distanziamento sociale, il 28 maggio sull'helicopter money, il 4 giugno sulle infrastrutture di ricerca europee. questo è il blocco dei primi 4, diciamo, che seguono il seminario di apertura al quale partecipiamo questa sera, e il sito di questi, scusate, le informazioni riguardo a questi e ai prossimi saranno disponibili sul sito della SIE. Riguardo all'ospite, Alberto ha già anticipato quello che era i passaggi più importanti. Io posso aggiungere appunto che da macroeconomista si è occupato e si occupa di cicli economici e di crisi finanziarie. Dopo il PhD nel 2001 all'MIT, Guido è stato ancora all'MIT a Princeton, e poi nel 2013 dal 2013 è a Northwestern, è consulente della Federal Reserve Bank di Chicago e associato di ricerca all'NBR. Ovviamente poi i suoi lavori parlano da soli, e in aggiunta a questa intensa attività editoriale che richiamava prima Alberto, che fa riferimento al fatto che abbia delle posizioni da co-editor nel Journal of International Economics, di associate editor nell'American Economic Review e il Journal of Economic Perspective. Io non vorrei prendere altro tempo, ne ho preso già troppo, ma aiuterò Guido da moderatore, insomma, in questo incontro. L'ultima cosa che volevo dire è semplicemente il paper che ci presenterà, lo vedete già apparso nella prima slide di introduzione. Il titolo è un lungo titolo del quale io mi limito a leggere soltanto la prima parte: Macroeconomic Implication of Covid-19. È un paper a 4 autori, Guerrieri, Straub e Werning, coautori insieme a Guido Lorenzoni, e questo paper è già apparso come working paper all'aprile 2020 del National Bureau of Economic Research. Io direi a questo punto non vorrei aggiungere altro se non dare la parola a Guido, che ha, credo, libertà di scegliere l'italiano o l'inglese come sua lingua di presentazione. Guido, a te la parola, prego.
Bene, grazie mille. Provo a fare in italiano. Ho visto velocemente la lista dei partecipanti, mi sembra assolutamente quasi tutti italiani, quindi ci provo. Poi se impastisco un po' qualche espressione più di gergo
se ti senti più a tuo agio perché già l'hai presentato in inglese, per noi va bene uguale.
No,
quindi
ci provo, alla fine è la mia lingua madre, quindi
vero.
errori, insomma, semmai mi aiuterete, se c'è qualche cosa di gergale che mi sfugge mi chiederò aiuto. Grazie mille a Alberto e Marco per queste gentili parole di presentazione, e grazie per avermi invitato a presentare questo lavoro. Questo chiaramente è un lavoro che nasce, insomma, sulla spinta dell'attualità in modo ovvio. Facciamo delle considerazioni generali sull'effetto economico di una pandemia e soprattutto delle politiche di stare a casa che vengono imposte durante una pandemia per cercare di contenere la diffusione delle infezioni. Però da questa motivazione iniziale poi in realtà ci siamo concentrati su una domanda che in qualche modo è generale, è una domanda generale di macro, ed è quando può succedere che uno shock, che fondamentalmente è uno shock di offerta, però può causare uno shock di domanda ancora più grande dello shock di offerta iniziale, al punto che di fatto l'economia si trova in una situazione di mancanza di domanda aggregata. Di solito non è così, di solito uno shock di offerta, il classico shock di offerta che si usa nei libri di testo è un aumento del prezzo del petrolio, il shock di offerta che abbiamo visto negli anni 70. Il tipico shock di offerta, di solito la previsione è che creerà un eccesso di domanda, non una mancanza di domanda, perché l'offerta aggregata, cioè la capacità dell'economia di produrre beni e servizi si contrae, la domanda non si contrae altrettanto, e quindi di fatto c'è un eccesso di domanda e una spinta inflazionistica, che infatti nel caso degli anni 70 era veramente visibile. Lo shock che viviamo, un altro esempio può essere un una guerra in cui molte risorse devono essere spostate verso lo sforzo bellico e tanti giovani devono andare a combattere, e anche quello è uno shock grosso di offerta. Allo stesso tempo, in più, di solito c'è anche una spinta di domanda per produrre armi e materiali, e quindi di fatto anche lì c'è una spinta inflazionistica. Invece l'osservazione che vogliamo fare è che questo tipo di shock di offerta, quello legato a un lockdown e quindi a chiusure di una serie di esercizi, eccetera, può avere invece l'effetto opposto sulla differenza tra domanda e offerta, cioè può creare una situazione in cui c'è una mancanza di domanda.
Guido, ti interrompo perché nella chat
certo.
è intervenuto qualcuno straniero, Tamar, che ci chiedeva se è in inglese o in italiano, cioè ovviamente lui non è in grado di seguire. Is it gonna be in Italian language? Quindi non so se...
Posso passare all'inglese,
c'è uno straniero, quindi per...
Sì, va bene, se sono stranieri passo senza problema l'inglese.
Perdonami.
No, ci mancherebbe. Very good. So let's switch to English. I didn't really, I mean, I went quickly through the list of participants, and I was reading all Italian names. That's why I thought that I could switch easily to Italian. But if there is some English-speaking only participants, I'm very happy to switch to English. So I'm going to be speaking English from now on. So I was saying briefly, okay, that the motivation of this paper is in current events, of course, but then it became also kind of an interesting broader exercise in understanding under what conditions it is possible that a shock that is predominantly a shock to supply, so it can be thought of predominantly as a supply shock, can actually cause a shortage of demand. So it can cause a contraction in demand that is even bigger than the initial contraction in supply. So that actually, instead of having inflationary pressures, which are the typical outcome of a supply shock, we actually get deflationary pressures. Why is this question important? Of course, this question is important because it informs the way in which we think about the policy response to the crisis. And in particular, the question is whether we want to do expansionary policies and encourage people to spend more or not. So actually, all this discussion is in this next slide. Okay, so there are obviously large effects of the pandemic on the world economy. Real-time data tell us that, for example, for the US, we have real-time data like the unemployment insurance claims for the last few weeks, and the picture is shocking. I mean, there's like 4 or 5 million of new unemployment claims every week for the last 4 weeks, which means a large effect on unemployment. People that are kind of trying to make predictions based on this real-time data talk about at least 15%, 20% unemployment in the US for the current quarter. Governments and central banks are definitely showing a willingness to act, and some are already acting, and we see that. I mean, in Italy, there is already a large fiscal package to deal with the pandemic. In the US, there is a large fiscal package, and the central banks are doing all they can to help with liquidity. But I mean, there is kind of 2 dimensions to the policy response. There is one dimension of the policy response, which we can think of like as disaster relief. It's like there is a hurricane, some people lose their house, and we want to provide to these people support so that they can live, that they can support their livelihood. So that dimension is clear. I mean, the motivation for that is clear. There are some people that are going to lose their income and be in very difficult situations for a while. So we want to help those people. So that's that kind of disaster relief part of the policy. And on that, there isn't much doubt that we need some of that. But the other side of the policy is whether should we stimulate the economy. And of course, the two things are related, because if we provide help to people that lose their income, of course, we are also helping these people spend more. So there is always a stimulus element in what we do. But the question is whether the stimulus element is desirable, or whether the stimulus element is going to cause inflationary pressures and potential distortion, so that we actually need to compensate a bit, like give some money to people that are in trouble, but overall have a bit of a tightening of the overall policy stance to balance the inflationary pressure. That is the open debate, and on which there isn't a lot of clarity. So that's where we start. So what we show is that it's possible that a shock that starts from the supply side can actually kind of transmit to the demand side and actually be even larger on the demand side. We use this label that we call them Keynesian supply shocks just because we needed a label, and we thought that would be kind of informative. And we show essentially two things. We show that to get something that looks like a Keynesian supply shock in a model, in a simple model of the economy, you need at least two ingredients. You need some element of complementarity across goods, across sectors, and then it helps if you also have incomplete markets. Once we have established this main result, then we explore a variety of variations on the main result that are mostly motivated by understanding better two issues. One is, how do we measure the degree of complementarity in the economy? How do we figure out whether we are indeed in a situation of a Keynesian supply shock or not? And second, what is the best way to intervene? So what is the optimal policy in the current situation? And we have a few implications of policy, and I'm going to talk about them. The bottom line, very simply, is that expansionary monetary fiscal policy may actually be desirable, and that there is not going to be an immediate concern with inflationary pressure. Let me be clear, we're not saying anything about what is going to happen 1-2 years from now, once there is a big accumulation of government debt, and whether that accumulation of government debt is going to have inflationary consequences after the crisis is over. But we're very clear that during the crisis, it's very likely that there's not going to be an inflationary concern. And the last point is that when we think about the optimal policy mix, our main point is going to be that the best thing to do is to provide relief to the people more directly affected. Even though that is essentially disaster relief, it's a disaster relief that has a stimulus element. Paul Krugman used the nice expression like disaster relief with a dash of stimulus. So, and our conclusions are very much in line with that prescription. And why is social insurance the best way? We'll talk about that. And by social insurance, of course, we're very broad. We're thinking about all kinds of transfers that help the people that lose their jobs. Let me preview briefly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to start with a simple, like super basic, single sector model. And we're going to put a supply shock in that simple basic model. We're going to also look at the case of incomplete markets and heterogeneity. So we're going to put heterogeneous consumers which are differentially affected by the shock. But even with that modification, we're never going to get a Keynesian supply shock. And that is a pretty general result. So pretty general result is that in one sector model, you get a shock to supply. The shock to demand is there, but it's never as big. And I'll try to give you some intuition for that result. Then we'll turn to a multi-sector model. And the crucial observation is that when you have a shock where like half of the sectors of the economy shut down, that is different from a shock where like all the sectors are affected proportionally. When all the sectors are affected proportionally, the economy looks a bit like the single sector economy because there aren't obviously obvious asymmetries. And so we go back to the previous result. But when some sectors are affected more strongly than others, then the effect could be Keynesian. And of course, what we have in mind here is that there are some sectors that are very contact intensive, meaning that to produce the goods and services in those sectors, you need to have people come in close contact. the extreme example is like, I think, like actually we've seen some data on that kind of ranks jobs by the degree of contact intensive. And I think the extreme example is the dentist. I mean, there's no way you can get a dentist appointment and not have somebody get very close to your mouth. So that's an example of a very contact intensive job. And the other extreme would be, I guess, a video game designer that is sitting at home, is designing a video game, then is sending it to you by the internet. In that case, there is no contact at all between you and the video game designer, and he's providing you a service. And of course, there's no possibility of infection. And so in between these two extremes, there is all the sectors in the economy. And of course, which sector is going to be affected depends on the public health policies that the government puts in place, right? The public health policies can be very tight, as they are in Italy up to now. So essentially shutting down every non-essential business. And then in that case, of course, the sector affected is going to be a huge chunk of the economy. Or they could be somewhere intermediate where you allow, for example, for manufacturing to go on mostly as normal under some rules, and then in that case, the affected sector will be smaller. Of course, kind of our analysis is most interesting for these intermediate cases in which there is a part of the economy that could be still operating almost as normal, not exactly as normal. But then there is one sector of the economy that is completely shut down. And the question is what happens to the completely shut down part of the economy affects the part of the economy that could be still operating. And the question is whether the fact that activity shuts down here, is it going to affect activity here? And is it going to affect it in an expansionary way or in a contractionary way? And that's going to be how we frame a problem. And then we're going to emphasize these two forces, the complementarity and the incomplete markets. Let me give you just, I'm going to try to put very few equations on the board today. Correct. So I have 40 minutes. I had planned a 40 minutes presentation. So I actually, remind me, I started at 5:20. Is that correct? Or 5:15?
Unmute. Yes, 15. 5:15.
5:15. So I should plan on going until
let's say at 6.
Yeah, a little. Okay.
Yes. Okay. 45 minutes.
Yeah, maybe 5 minutes before.
5 minutes before.
Yeah, let's do that. So we have more time for a Q&A at the end. Okay. Very good. So I'm just going to put down a very basic one sector model, a very simple example. And I mean, just because in this case, it's kind of visually very compelling why the effect of a supply shock is never to contract demand more. So think of and just a remark, there is always kind of two ways of looking at the problem. And the two ways of looking at the problem are kind of the same, but it's just looking at the problem from two different angles. One way to look at the problem is to ask in what direction does the natural interest rate goes? And that question is like, suppose that we want to hit full employment, do we need monetary policy to tighten or to ease to reach full employment? And that's one way of looking at things. So one way to looking at things is ask in what direction is the natural rate moving? The other way to looking at things is like, suppose that monetary policy doesn't ease enough. So suppose that, for example, monetary policy keeps the rate exactly unchanged, then do we get unemployment or do we get inflation? So those are two ways of looking at things. And of course, you can always go from one to the other. If the natural rate is going up and we're not pushing it up, then we end up with excess demand. If the natural rate is going down and we don't push it down, then we end up with lack of demand. So the two things are always going to give us the same answer. But sometimes one is more interesting than the other, because in particular, the second one is going to be interesting because it's going to tell us something also about the gravity of the recession that we can encounter if we don't intervene. And so the first one is sometimes easier to understand, because you can just look at the kind of neoclassical full employment economy and just immediately figure out in what direction the natural rate needs to go. So I'm going to be using both ways of looking at the problem, even though they're really kind of like two sides of the same coin. Very good. So take infinite horizon economy. Consumers have standard time separable preferences with a discount factor beta. We have here, and suppose that there is just a fixed endowment of labor. So there's no choice of labor supply, just everybody has n bar units of labor and everybody's just supplying that. And suppose that there is a linear technology. So the n bar units of labor just transform into n bar units of stuff, of goods and services. And then suppose that there is a temporary, so the economy is going along. So I'm just going to do a little graph here, and then, so this is time. The economy is in steady state, so output is here, okay, at n bar. And then at day 0, there is a shock. And the shock is just that some people cannot work anymore, like 1 minus 5, fraction phi of the workers in this economy cannot work anymore, because if they go to work, they get sick. All the other workers can still work because they have a different type of job where they don't get sick if they go to work. And so we get just a reduction in labor supply. What happens to natural output? By natural output, I mean the output of full employment. Well, the output of full employment is going to go down. Then tomorrow, this is a temporary shock, okay? We're going to do a shock like one period, and then tomorrow the pandemic is gone and we go back to normal. Tomorrow we go back to normal, so tomorrow output goes back, and that's it. So that's as simple as it is. Okay, so if this is what happens to output, this is also what happens to consumption. So if we have a representative agent in this economy, so there is no problem of insurance or anything, all the agents in this economy are part of a big family, and the family is like completely taking care of everybody, then we're going to have that for everybody in this economy. Consumption is going to go down, and then it's going to go back up. And then you can just look at the Euler equation, at the optimality condition for this representative consumer, and it's going to give you something like this. Okay? It's going to give you that the real rate is going to be given by the ratio of the marginal utility in period 0 and in the following period. And in period 0, there is less consumption than tomorrow. So in a sense, like everybody in this economy, consumption contracts, so everybody would like to borrow, right? Because they think, okay, tomorrow I'm going to have higher consumption. Tomorrow we will be out of the shock. So I would like to consume more today if I could. And so the only way in which we can keep people spending as much as the goods and services that are available is by increasing the real rate. Okay, so this thing is going to go up. And that's kind of the surprising thing. Like in this economy, to keep the economy of full employment and avoid inflation, the central banks needs to tighten monetary policy, increase interest rates. Because this is like, I mean, it's a bad event, but it's like good news in a sense that the future looks better than the present. And if the future looks better than the present, everybody would like to kind of consume a little bit more today than the resources that are available today. And so actually there would be kind of excess demand if the central bank doesn't actually tighten. I mean, it sounds surprising if we think about current events and we see what's going on, but the logic of the model is very compelling. So we have to think of forces that kind of undo or to some extent this logic. So the first thing that we started, when we started this project, the first thing we thought is like, okay, but that is a result that relies a lot on complete markets. Like here, there is nobody that needs to cut their consumption a lot just because they lost their job, they have no money, they have very little liquid assets, which is a very realistic assumption. And those guys are going to have to cut their consumption a lot. So maybe if we put together the consumers, like the consumers in this model that are like forward-looking and can borrow as much as they can, and then we put them together with some consumers that are not like this, that are more like hand to mouth, as people say, or like consumers that don't have many liquid resources, don't find it easy to borrow, and actually they just lose a lot of income because of the shock, then maybe the sum of all these behaviors is going to be actually contractionary, meaning that demand will actually fall more. And then we worked out the logic of this argument, and we realized that that is not enough. That just the fact of having incomplete markets, meaning just the fact of having heterogeneous consumers, limited insurance, limited financial markets, is actually not going to be sufficient to undo this result. And let me give you very briefly what is, first let me state this result. Okay, so one sector in complete markets, negative supply shock, increase in the natural rate, increase in excess demand, but also with incomplete markets, nothing changes, okay? Why so? Well, the argument is very simple. Like, the supply shock is reducing people's incomes. Can it be that people consumption decreases more? Well, for consumption to decrease more than your drop in income, you would need a marginal propensity to consume for somebody that is bigger than one. And the incomplete markets can make marginal propensity to consume large. It could be when you introduce incomplete markets in the models, essentially what you do is to have more consumers, more households in your model, that when their income drop, they cut their consumption more. So you can have higher marginal propensities to consume, but you cannot have marginal propensity to consume bigger than one. That's the essence. Your income falls. The hand to mouth, who are the most constrained people in the economy, what they're going to do is when their income falls by 10, they're going to just contract consumption by 10, but not by more. That's something that just doesn't happen. You cannot get it working in this model. So that's why there is going to be a large contraction in output. There is going to be a large contraction in incomes. There is going to be a large contraction in consumption, but the contraction in consumption is not going to be as large as the contraction in income. Now, let's go to multi-sectors. Now, with multi-sectors, things get more interesting and more complicated at the same time. So how do we model multi-sectors? We're going to do something very simple. We're going to have like just two sectors and explore our logic in the two sectors. Now, of course, in the real economy, there is many sectors. And when you start thinking about how the effect of the lockdown in one sector affects the rest of the economy, the effects may be different. So, of course, there are some sectors that are immediately shut down, and this would be like restaurants, gyms, hotels, all kind of like entertainment, like live entertainment. All those things are going to be affected directly the moment you have a lockdown. People cannot leave the home, so they cannot go to the restaurant, and restaurants just close. Now, as people spend less on these items, the question is, the fact that these items are no longer available, does it induce you to spend more or less on other stuff? And of course, we have examples where you do spend more. Right? Those are substitute goods. Okay? The first one, of course, if you stop going to restaurants, you're going to have to prepare more food at home. So people are going to buy more groceries. Right? So that will be a case of a good that is a substitute. However, there is complements. Okay? There is a lot of goods that are actually complements to going out and doing a lot of activities. If you don't go to a restaurant, maybe you're going to buy less clothes to go out. If you don't go to a hotel, if you don't travel, you're going to buy less luggage. And so there are many examples of goods that have complementarity. And I'm going to talk more about complementarity and what does it mean and how can it be measured. But for the moment, just realize that there are both forces there. And the question is that if the complementarity forces are strong enough, then they may end up spend less overall on these other goods. And so that will be a force that causes the recession to spread. And so now you have these other sectors, and these other sectors could keep going on, okay? So I'm thinking of an economy in which the factories that produce sport equipment, for example, are still open, and they could still be producing sport equipment, and just people are not buying sport equipment because they are not going out and playing their favorite sports. And so the demand for these factors is going to go down, even though the workers there could could continue producing under certain safety conditions. And so that is the first force that we emphasize. So this is just a little picture to kind of represent our simple economy. There are workers in both sectors, and they produce goods, and the economy is like of course, a much more complex, but already in this picture, you see there is a lot of interactions, because the workers in both sectors spend in both sectors, and they receive income from the sector where they work on. So when there is a lockdown, the effect is that this sector here is shocked. You can no longer buy stuff here. And so you're going to have to ask yourself, how does the income of these two guys is redirected to spending in the two sectors? So again, just another slide of equations. So the model is very simple. It's just like a simple constant elasticity of substitution utility function. And now there is two goods. There is good 1, there is good 2. And the elasticity of substitution between the two goods is 1 over rho. So rho is this parameter here. And then there is the intertemporal elasticity of substitution, which is 1 over sigma, and sigma is this parameter here. And we'll see that these two parameters will matter a lot for what we conclude later. Okay? And so we do the same exercise in this economy as we did in the one sector economy. So we just have a supply shock, a labor supply shock, but it's going to be a specific one. It's going to be that there's going to be workers, there's going to be phi n bar workers that work in sector 1 minus phi that work in sector 2. And we're just going to assume that this just goes away. That the workers in the restaurant industry just have to stay home. And so there is no longer any possibility of consuming restaurants. And so this goes to 0. And again, the shock is a one-time shock, and tomorrow it goes away. So what is going to be the effect of the shock? Just a simple observation. We put the weights here to be phi and 1 minus phi, which are exactly the same as the relative labor supplies. That's just a normalization. So the relative price in normal times is 1. And that's just convenient for the analysis. It doesn't affect, of course, anything. Very good. So the shock is just that suddenly you can no longer consume this stuff for one period. And then tomorrow you can go back to consuming. So what is going to be now the effect? There is still an Euler equation. We can still derive an Euler equation, okay? But the Euler equation now looks like this. It's a little different, right? Before, we had here 0 plus like 1 minus phi m bar, and then here we just had m bar. So we just like had phi m bar plus 1 minus phi m bar. Okay, think of the numerator as having this argument at the top and this argument at the bottom if the goods are perfect substitutes. But if the goods are not perfect substitutes, thing is a bit different. The question is more like, in what direction the natural rate goes if we want to keep full employment in sector 2, if we want to still keep consumption of goods 2 at the level at which we can produce, even though there is no longer sector 1 there, even though there is a 0 here. And then the condition for a drop in the natural interest rate, so the condition for a lack of demand in the economy after the shock, is going to look like this. So it's going to have to do with the shock, but crucially, it's going to have to do with the difference between rho and sigma. And in particular, because this is a number smaller than 1, if rho is bigger than sigma, we're going to have a contractionary effect. Remember that rho and sigma are the inverse of the elasticity of substitution, so this is the other way to put it. So let me give you a very quick intuition for this, okay? So the fact that we want rho to be high or 1 over rho to be small is natural. The rho controls the degree of complementarity between the two goods. So when rho is large or 1 over rho is small, it means that the goods are relatively complement. And so when you can no longer consume good 1, then you don't want to consume good 2. It's like the marginality of good 2 goes down. And that's one force that goes in our favor. The other side is the intertemporal elasticity of substitution. And the intertemporal elasticity of substitution, instead, we want it to be high. why? Well, one way to think about it, and like our favorite way to think about it, is the following. In a sense, a pandemic shock is a shock that really increases the shadow price of a bunch of goods. It's like, think of it like, you can still go to a restaurant, it's just that the price is infinity. It's like a very high price for those goods. So it's as if it's not really inflation. Typically inflation is like when you have high inflation today and then you expect it to keep going up. This is more like a spike in the price level. It's like today prices are very high, shadow prices that include everything. And so the question is like, in a situation where today's shadow prices are high and tomorrow are low, do you wanna shift consumption to today or do you wanna shift it to the future? And when 1 over sigma is relatively high, so when the intertemporal elasticity of substitution is relatively high, what you wanna do is just shift it to the future. So the idea is like, prices are very high today. This is not a good time to spend. So I'm just gonna save some of the money that I saved by not going in restaurants and keep it for tomorrow, because tomorrow I'm gonna be able again to go to restaurants and to enjoy everything a little more. And so that's why I will shift my consumption to the future. So a high intertemporal elasticity of substitution means willingness to save, high willingness to save when you're shocked in one sector of the economy. 1 over rho means high complementarity between the goods. And now, so we have a little more of an intuition for why this is the condition. Okay, so if I plot kind of a region, the region where Keynesian supply shocks can arise, this is it, is when the intertemporal elasticity is sufficiently high or when the intratemporal elasticity is sufficiently low. So we have this region here. What we're gonna see is that in the moment we introduce incomplete markets into the picture, so when we now go back to the idea, okay, some people are actually losing their incomes and those people are gonna find it hard to keep their spending at the original level just because they don't have any income anymore and they cannot borrow, then we're gonna expand the region of parameters for which we get this result. So let's go there. Let's add incomplete markets now. Okay. So now the workers in the affected sectors lose their income and they're gonna cut back spending in all sectors. So this is gonna be now the force that I was describing before. And we know that that force alone was not enough. But now combined with multi-sector, maybe is enough. Sorry, maybe is enough. Maybe it amplifies the first thing. So in terms of that little picture that I drew at some point, you see that we go from this situation before the shock to this situation after the shock. But now the new thing is that this link is no longer there. This sector 1 workers are on their own. They lose their income and they have to cut back on spending a lot. Now, of course, these guys, relative to a perfect insurance world, are actually a little better off because they don't have to pay insurance claims to these guys. But the question is that these guys have a lower MPC. Right? These guys are rich already, so their extra spending is not going to be enough. So when we switch to this picture, the effect is going to be bigger. And here, I'm not going to give you the algebra for this result. I'm just going to show you, use again this graph. Again, so this graph is showing you the response of the model to a one-time shock depending on the parameters of the model. And again, on this axis here, we have the intratemporal elasticity, so how much the goods are complements or substitutes, and here we have the intertemporal elasticity. And now remember that before introducing incomplete markets, so before introducing the fact that people are imperfectly insured and that people with low income have a higher marginal propensity to consume, the region where we get a decline in demand was just this region here. And now once we expand to allow for incomplete markets, now that region grows and it becomes this whole region here. So that is the crucial observation here, is that incomplete markets magnify the effect of having multiple sectors with limited substitutability between goods. And so it enlarges the region of the parameters for which we can get Keynesian supply shock. So that is really the core message of the paper. So the core message is that it is possible to get supply shocks that end up contracting demand more. It is possible to have supply shocks that actually cause deflation instead of inflation. And that the two natural forces that are gonna move us in that direction are limited substitution between goods and limited insurance for people in the affected sectors. Now that we have this structure, we can start to use this structure to start to think about policy questions, extensions, relation between public health policies and macro policies. And so I'm going to do a little bit of that in the next few slides, and then I'll wrap up. So I'll skip this. Okay, fiscal policy. One thing that surprised us is that actually fiscal policy in this world is less powerful than in the model without this kind of asymmetric shock. But this asymmetric shock actually kind of reduces the power of fiscal policy. So in particular, if we think about fiscal policy as like a pure traditional kind of G, so like increasing purchases of goods and services by the government. The problem is that the people that are mostly affected, so the people with the highest MPC, are the people in the sectors that are shut down. So if you just do fiscal policy by expanding G, by buying more goods and services, and of course you're going to buy in the sectors where goods and services can be produced, you're going to be helping the workers that don't have the highest MPC. So actually the fiscal policy would be less powerful because the standard kind of multiplier argument is that I increase purchases of goods in this sector, and then the income of the workers in that sector are going to go up, and this workers are going to spend it, and so you get a second round, a third round, and that's the Keynesian multiplier. Unfortunately, the Keynesian multiplier is less strong here because if you don't help directly the people in the affected sectors, you're not gonna get there by just buying goods and services. So standard government purchases are less powerful. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that, and any type of intervention is less powerful. Even if we help directly the workers, again, we're not gonna have the multiplier effect. So even if I help directly the workers in restaurant business and I give them some unemployment transfer, yes, of course, they will spend that, so they will be happy. But we were not going to get a second round effect. They're not going to spend it on restaurants. Restaurants are still shut down, so they're going to spend it on other stuff. So we're not going to get the multiplier effect going there. So that is the first observation, which, I mean, it's also important for a general question, because that means that even if you have a large fiscal policy intervention, it's not easy to flip the sign of the overall effect on aggregate demand. So it's still possible that you have a lack of aggregate demand and deflation, even if you do massive fiscal stimulus, because massive fiscal stimulus is not going to be particularly powerful in this situation. Let me just, so I'm going to go back to policy, and so don't take this slide as saying that it's not desirable to do fiscal policy. As just this is just a positive statement about the effects. Then we're going to go back to what is desirable, what is optimal in this environment. I just want to talk for a second about supply chains. Remember that our argument relies a lot on the degree of complementarity between sectors. And in the model, that was purely driven by preferences. That was purely something driven by consumers' behavior. But in reality, there is another channel by which there might be complementarities. And the other channel is the input-output structure of the economy. So it's possible, okay, if restaurants shut down, restaurants, for example, use accounting services from an accountant, and the demand for the accountant is going to go down. Again, the accountant is in the other sector, is in the in sector 2, where you don't need physical proximity to conduct. You can do it online easily via email, but the demand for accountant services is going to go down because restaurants use that. So input output. Oh, it looks like we got. Sorry, it happens sometimes. I think I got stuck on the old slide on the screen. Okay, now you see the supply chain. Yeah. So, so input-output linkages matter, and in particular, if the affected sectors use intermediate inputs or capital goods produced by non-affected sectors, then you're going to have a drop in demand through that channel. So once we introduce input-output linkages, we can get the condition for a Keynesian supply shock is even easier to meet. Again, here the example of restaurants that are using dishwashing machines, and they're going to just buy those. So the interesting thing is that when the shock initially happened, there was a lot of emphasis, if you look at the newspapers, on the supply chains. And I guess the idea was like, initially the shock was in China. And so the concern was like, okay, there's going to be disruption to supply chains for goods that use bits and pieces that come from China. And so the concern was that actually supply chains could amplify the supply shock to the economies that were not affected yet. Here instead, in a sense, we're kind of like emphasizing the opposite direction. So the logic of a supply chain is like somebody cannot do that little gadget that goes into your iPhone, so the whole iPhone cannot be produced. And so then a little supply shock here makes a bigger supply shock. Our argument is different. Our argument is that the same type of chains means that if the person at the end of the chain, so if the business that is downstream gets hit and cannot sell anymore, is not going to demand, is going to reduce demand for the upstream. So it's kind of like a kind of a demand side supply chain. Very good. We also look at cascades of business exits. So here, like in the baseline model, the only sectors that shut down are the sectors that are directly affected by the shock. But we also consider the case in which there are sectors that maybe are not directly affected, but because their demand falls enough, they shut down because they cannot meet their fixed costs. They cannot cover their fixed costs. And so that actually, again, is going to cause another supply shock. And again, because we are in this Keynesian regime, the supply shock is going to further amplify the demand shock. This is kind of related to an old literature that was like a literature on the big push and in development economics, and there are some interesting connection with that literature. Okay, so now let me say one thing about public health, and then I'll be done. I think my time is up, so that's good. So far, we just assumed that sector one was shut down, but we didn't have a rationale for shutting down sector one. We just said, you do it. Now we have an extension of the model where we introduce health. So where we introduce an externality, at the standard like Pigouvian externality, in which people underestimate the cost of spreading the virus. And in that environment, we can make some remarks. Well, the first one that is very basic is like, if you don't have a shutdown of sector one, so if the only thing that happens is that sector one contracts a bit because people are afraid of going to restaurants. So restaurants contract a bit, but you don't close the restaurants yet. You don't have a stay-at-home policy. Then you can have a situation where you have unemployment, but it may be that from a social point of view, that unemployment is actually a good thing because it reduces the spread of the virus. So it is possible that without optimal public health policy, it's possible that you have like kind of a Keynesian wedge that goes against the Pigouvian externality. The Keynesian wedge is like unemployment is bad, is wasted resources, but on the other hand, using these resources would increase the spread of the virus and maybe be overall bad for the economy. And that's a very simple observation, but it's useful to keep in mind. So then we switch to a problem where instead you do a shutdown, so you do a lockdown, you stop sector one for producing. And in the simple case in which sector two is completely clean, so here the assumption is that sector two doesn't contribute at all to the spread of the virus, then you can just shut down sector one. Then shutting down sector one may cause a Keynesian supply shock in sector two. And so then you need some help from monetary and fiscal policy. So this remark here is that there is a complementarity between public health objectives and macro objectives. Like if you do optimal public health policy, if you shut down the sectors that are most harmful from a health policy point of view, then you're going to need some macro policy to avoid a lack of demand in the other sectors. So the two things kind of go together, hand in hand. And then the final observation is that actually kind of targeted transfers that help people in affected sectors are somehow kind of the magic bullet here, because they help you in three different dimensions. They give insurance. Okay, this is the disaster relief element of the story. You just want to help people that got into a lot of trouble. The second one is that if monetary policy is at the ZLB, if fiscal policy is constrained by budgetary constraints and so on, if you use the money wisely and give it to the people that use it, you may flip the sign of the effect, right? We may go from the region in which we had a Keynesian supply shock to the region where we don't have a Keynesian supply shock. So you may make your life easier. And then the final observation, which is also interesting, is that if you do so if you do a policy that kind of fixes the macro effect, it's kind of like you're shifting the trade-off between economic activity and the spread of the disease. And so it may be easier to do public health policies that actually contract some sectors very heavily, because at least you are contrasting the undesirable macro effect. I think I want to stop here so that we have some time for Q&A. So I will, yeah, I had a couple of remarks on Italy, and the main remark I wanted to make is that when we are at the peak of the emergency, so when everything is shut down, then our message is not going to be particularly interesting. Like if there is basically, if nobody can produce anything, then the only concern is going to be disaster relief and providing resources to the healthcare sector and to essential services, but that's going to be very basic. So in a sense, our paper is going to be even more useful when we kind of move to a phase 2 or whatever you want to call it, when actually you start to have some reopenings of businesses, and the question is like, is there going to be enough demand for these businesses? The other observation actually I wanted to add is like, there is of course an international dimension to the problem. So I emphasize complementarities between sectors, but of course there is also complementarities between countries. And I guess the basic observation here is that policy coordination is particularly desirable here. Okay, now I stop.
Okay, so thank you very much, Guido. I really appreciate your presentation. We have a list of questions open. I think you can see them. And on the Q&A section.
Q&A and I see the chat, yes.
Yes, and just close to the chat, there is the Q&A section. There are 5 questions.
Just open the Q&A and go through it. I'm happy, I mean, the questions are, I mean, if the questions are unclear, I can ask clarification, but I think.
Okay.
Well, I see here Victoria Chirazi asking, what about uncertainty? So uncertainty, yes. Yeah. So that's a very important channel that we don't look at. Okay, so there's, I mean, I would say that there are 2 channels that we kind of leave aside. So there are 2 channels by which demand can be affected that are not in our analysis, and they're definitely important in real life. We decided to leave them aside just because we wanted to focus on household behavior and incomplete markets. But one is uncertainty. So there is the idea like, okay, if there is a lot more uncertainty about where are we going, what is going to happen next, and definitely there is a lot of uncertainty, then that is also going to have a contractionary effect on spending. And I mean, the first example is investment spending. Of course, like purchase of capital goods is going to be probably heavily affected by the fact that businesses have huge uncertainty about the world in which we're going to be in 6 months, in a year or so. So that is definitely relevant. Again, we decided to leave it aside because we wanted to focus on this. In part, we also decided to leave it aside because it's true that there is a lot of uncertainty. But, I mean, broadly speaking, we must expect that in 6 months, in a year, things are going to be better than today. So it's true that there is a lot of uncertainty, but it's also true that this is a shock that is very front-loaded. This is a shock that is definitely very bad today. And I mean, tomorrow is, I mean, we don't know what is going to happen, but the uncertainty is like, there is a distribution of outcomes, but I mean, more lockdown than we're now, we're not going to be. I mean, that's pretty hard. I mean, apart if we put ourselves in a freezer, each of us, that there isn't much more lockdown that we can do than this. So in a very front-loaded, when the shock is very front-loaded, the uncertainty argument can help, but up to a point. The other thing that we also leave aside, which is also very important and also affects the demand side, is kind of a financial crisis element of the problem. Okay, so there are kind of liquidity disruptions due to the fact that business cash flow is completely disrupted during the thing, and those things can cause disruption in financial markets and disruption in the banking system, and of course we see a lot of the intervention of central banks have to do with kind of correcting those things, and so that is definitely very important. That we leave aside it just in the interest of simplicity, because it would be complicated to have everything in the same model. But there are I'm just going to point, there is a very nice paper by Miguel Faria y Castro, for example, that instead it's all about that. It's all about the fact that you have a disruption today, The disruption may cause a lot of loans to go bad because people cannot repay their loans. So you're going to have non-performing loans in banks' balance sheets, and then banks are going to be in trouble, and you're going to have a credit crunch channel that can also contract demand. That is definitely an important concern. And I guess actually this is very related to the second question that I see by Francesco Martione, which is also very much on point, is risk premium. Okay? So risk premium is exactly about the channel that I just described. So a channel that goes through from bad loans to the banking system and to price of risk going up, and possibly also directly from uncertainty effect. And so that is again, that is a very, very important concern that we just leave aside. The shock permanent again. So there's someone I cannot see the name, but there is a question that is interesting about, like, what about the shock being more permanent? Again, I would say yes, we can think that the shock is going to have very persistent effects. That is going to be waves of pandemic coming back. But again, I think this shock is pretty front-loaded. I mean, things are maybe going to get better and then get worse again. But again, when they get worse, I have a hard time thinking how much worse than they are now can they be in terms of of lockdown measures. Now, Fadi Hassan asked a question that I think it's very important. And actually we have an entire section of the paper that is kind of devoted to try to understand that question. And I didn't talk about it, so let me say a word about that. So he says, we see that most of the fiscal response is towards firms through loan guarantees and so on. Is there a difference if the transfers are made to firms or workers? Is one better than the other? And so the model, as it is, it doesn't matter in the model. I mean, in the simple model, of course, as long as you get money through to the IMPC Sector 1 workers, if you go do it through the firm or directly, it doesn't matter. In reality, it matters, and the way we model it is we try to capture kind of what people call labor hoarding. So firms that retain the workers on their payroll, just so not to lose a good match. So if the worker is a good match with the firm, and so the value of the job is higher than separating, even if the worker is not producing anything for a few periods, it may be an optimal response to keep the worker on the payroll. And then the question is whether loan guarantees and other type of government interventions can kind of help labor hoarding, can make labor hoarding more desirable. And in the simple extension of the model that we look at, we just do it by changing the interest rate that firms face. If they face a lower interest rate, which you can think of it as a loan subsidy, then they're going to decide to keep the worker more. So that in our model, that is good, because again, if the matches are valuable, not only you're helping the income of the workers, but you're also preserving a valuable match. Now there are issues of implementation there. So there are issues of how do you design policies that protect jobs and not just the income of the workers in an effective way. So in particular, in the US, there is the US didn't have something like that. I guess Italy has a lot more experience with that because Cassa Integrazione is very much a policy like that. The US didn't have much experience, and they introduced this paycheck protection program, PPP, as part of the fiscal plan. And very early evidence suggests that this was not very effective, because it was actually not taken most by sectors that were more affected. It was actually taken more by businesses in different areas where they were less affected. And I guess the problem is that the way it was designed for businesses that were in really big trouble, that was not a good idea to take it up. And so there are important issues of design. And so the question is, like, are you just going to transfer money to the firms, or are you really going to encourage to keep the most vulnerable workers on the payroll? And that requires there are interesting questions of implementation. And Gabriella Chiesa asks any observation on the funding of subsidies, money versus public debt, and in the current version of the model, we don't have that distinction, and in general, the model, assumes essentially a government has that doesn't have budgetary problems in general. It doesn't have a problem of stock of public debt. So, of course, in Italy, that's much more an issue, and it's much more an issue whether ECB interventions can be helpful. We don't have much to say about that. Again, the one thing that we can say is the international dimension, is the fact that in a sense we can think of different countries as different sectors that are affected differently, and then of course the lack of insurance kind of at the European level is going to play a similar role as lack of insurance at the individual level. Are we expecting inflation when recovery comes, given that the supply shock is still there, at least in part? And again, my answer would be no. So I guess there are two issues. One issue is, are we expecting, so there are two ways of thinking about inflation, right? There is inflation as coming from an excess of demand, like if spending is too strong relative to the supply, then we can get inflation. There is another source of inflation, which is interaction between fiscal and monetary policies. So it's possible that if you have accumulated too much public debt and then you decide to monetize that, and then you get expansion in monetary policies too expansionary for the current stance, then you can get also inflation. Let's leave the second concern aside. So let's assume that the ECB is doing its job. The concern that we may have excess demand, I think it's, I would say no, in the sense that as you open up more, if the regime remains a regime of a Keynesian supply shock, as the supply shock fades away, well, it's still going to be true that there is going to be a lack of demand. The lack of demand is going to be smaller, but we have no particular reason to imagine why the sign will flip when the shock is smaller, when the shock affects a smaller amount of sectors. You would have to change like the substitutability or change the insurance properties. And we haven't thought of any obvious reason why things would go in that direction. Giuseppe De Arcangelis, old friend, I say hi, asks, can a hysteresis element be included in the model? So yeah, we have that. That is exactly in the labor hoarding model. In labor hoarding model, the destruction of jobs today then also damages potential output tomorrow, which is a form of hysteresis. And so it can make things worse indeed. Wait, let me just see how many questions. Yeah, I think I can answer all the questions. Sergio Denardis, there is no labor mobility from shutdown sector to the others. Oh, yeah, we have a section on labor mobility. Labor mobility does change the picture. It's interesting, kind of labor mobility can make things better, right? So it can make the recession less bad, because of course, if people can shift from one sector from the affected sector to the other sectors, then the recession can be ameliorated. But it can actually make worse the gap between potential output and aggregate demand. Because in a sense, like in the extreme case, if all the workers could move to sector 2 and produce a lot more of sector 2, so if suddenly all the workers that were in the restaurants could move and produce, say, luggage for travel, well, then you're going to have a bigger gap. You're going to have a lot of potential output in the luggage industry, and then still demand will be depressed. So you'd have a bigger gap there. So that's an interesting kind of counterintuitive thing, that actually labor mobility, yeah, makes things better, but it only makes things better if you have an even bigger stimulus. So it requires a bigger stimulus to get there. Slack tells me his name is Francesco. Hi, Francesco. And then Francesco Marchione asks, what is the impact in the model if we assume asymmetric productivity through the sectors? again, I guess the question is whether that asymmetric productivity, I mean, we could have asymmetric productivity in steady state and then nothing would change in the analysis. The question, I guess, is more whether there are effects on productivity because of the shock, as that's kind of related to the hysteresis issue. So I'm going to kind of refer to the answer I gave before. What recovery shape do you expect? That's a $1 million question. Do we expect the V shape that everybody dreams of, or a persistent effect? I mean, I guess that depends, in a sense, how strong are the forces for hysteresis here, right? How much the damage that is done by the crisis itself is going to cause kind of some permanent damage. I think that I think, of course, that depends on policy in part, but also I think it's possible that there is going to be, of course, a lot of destruction of good matches. On the other hand, because the economy is kind of a bit frozen, it shouldn't be exceedingly hard to kind of rebuild some of these matches as we get out. There are people that think that the economy that we're going to see when we get out of this is going to be drastically different in some dimensions. So there's going to be a lot of like innovation and a lot of more remote working. I think that is possible, but if anything, that would kind of make productivity higher. And so actually that would be good news. And so that would be more in favor of a V-shaped recovery. I think that the issues that weigh a bit against the V-shaped recovery is for some countries. I mean, of course, I'm thinking in particular of Italy. Of course, the public finance element is going to be heavy. I mean, there's going to be large deficits for a long time, and so of course, the recovery is going to have a bigger burden of public debt to deal with. So I think that may be an issue. But that aside, I don't see from kind of the technological or kind of like simple economic side of things, I don't see a strong reason why not to expect a V-shaped recovery. I mean, the problem is more like how persistent is going to be the shock. So somebody else asked that question. Like if we see recurrent waves, if we realize that it's very hard to deal with these pandemics, and then other pandemics happen, and this is like a recurrent problem, then of course, if we have a very persistent shock, we're going to have persistent effect. If the shock goes away, if something good happens on the healthcare front, and somehow we figure out how to deal with this thing, then I think a V-shaped recovery is my favorite prediction. But it's subject to all the uncertainty you want to add to that statement. Effects on wages. Yes, so I mean, that definitely. So the basic thing is that if we think that there is a lack of demand, the wages are not going to go up much. I mean, wages are, that's the crucial thing. If there is a supply shock and demand is still large, then you're going to see pressure on wages. I don't predict any upward pressure on wages. So I think wages and wage inflation as price inflation, I think is going to be subdued. Uncertainty, again, I think I talked about uncertainty already. Francesco Marchione asked about unemployment data and subject application seems related to COVID-19. I'm not sure. I don't know. I saw the composition by sectors, and it kind of seems to go in the right direction. So you see a lot more unemployment claims coming from restaurant, hospitality business. So I'm not too surprised. One thing that is surprising about kind of unemployment claims is that actually you see some bad data actually in the healthcare business, which you would think would be booming. But the truth is that actually because hospitals have to deal with COVID-19, a lot of electives and other things are shut down. So actually there is a decreasing demand for health in everything that is not COVID related. So actually you see even the health sector is affected negatively. Anyways, so yeah, so I think the complementarities matter, but I also think that the data overall suggests that the directly affected sectors are the most badly hit. But I'm happy to to talk more about this so that to understand better what dimension of the data you were thinking about. I think I covered all the Q&A I could see here. So
yes, you did. And so I think we can stop here, Guido.
Yeah, I would add just one, because I want to elaborate a bit on the question by Francesco Nufrio. Again, the idea is that, if I understood exactly the question, is that if you assume that in a sense beta is not constant, it's possible to have the same effect also in one sector model. Probably this is what...
Absolutely. Right. If people become more patient, if people worry a lot about the future and decide to save a lot, that is going to cause a demand shortage.
Exactly. So in a sense, you have, I'd say, you have neutrality, you have a sort of Modigliani-Miller theorem for one sector model, but you have different way in which it's possible that this result...
Absolutely. So I mean...
in terms of complementarity, or in terms... like Francesco suggests, in terms of time preferences. That is, or if you want, the ergodicity, sorry, about assumption about beta, about parameters. So if parameters change due to the crisis, of course, also in one sector model, you can have some sort of supply Keynesian recession.
That is very true, but let me add something more. Is that, in a sense, after the crisis, there was a lot of work. Like, I mean, there's one way of getting an increase in savings, and is to increase beta. And I think there is a lot of work that, in a sense, was in the incomplete markets, was to understand, can we get something that looks like an increase in beta? So can we get a situation in which people look like they're more patient in a like you take a standard model and it looks like people are getting more patient, but can we think of shocks to the financial sector, borrowing constraints, the ability of people to insure, or shocks to the incomplete market that could cause beta to go up, like that, something that looks like beta to go up. So essentially something that would induce people to consume less and save more, not because of a preference shock, but because of other shocks that travel through the economy. So the thing that kind of surprised us is that, so we had a very much like the same spirit in mind when we started doing the incomplete markets. We thought, okay, with incomplete markets, we know that you can get something that looks like people getting worried about the future, getting worried about uncertainty and saving more. And then we realized that that per se is not strong enough. I mean, it would be strong enough, again, if we think that the shock is coming tomorrow, right? If we are like, if we don't have a pandemic now, and sometimes somebody tells you, okay, you're gonna get a pandemic next month, then of course people will start saving. I mean, they're worried about the future, but again, I think with a front-loaded shock, where actually things are really bad today, and then tomorrow, hopefully they're gonna get a little better. The uncertainty helps, but it doesn't, I mean, and it can go in the direction of something that looks like a higher beta, but not all the way.
Thanks.
So, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. That was
okay. Okay, I think we can stop here. So once again, I want to thank you, Guido Lorenzoni, for his time and excellent seminar. So thank you really very much. And a very quick reminder to colleagues, our next date will be on May the 14th for another seminar of our series. So grazie molte Guido, grazie per essere stato con noi, grazie molte e grazie a tutti coloro che hanno partecipato e che hanno contribuito alla presentazione di Guido Lorenzoni con le loro domande e commenti. Arrivederci a tutti per il prossimo appuntamento. Di nuovo grazie Guido.
Grazie, ciao.